The evening began quietly. The house was illuminated by the soft light of garlands. The windows were decorated with snowflakes made of paper, and the smell of freshly baked gingerbread cookies was in the air. Susan, a 23-year-old college student, has just returned home for the Christmas holidays. Her parents went to a nearby town for a few days to help relatives prepare for the holiday, leaving Susan alone in their cozy home. She didn't complain about being alone. After a busy semester, it was even pleasant. Having turned on the Christmas music, she was sitting in her room, wrapped in a warm blanket, drinking hot chocolate. Time passed slowly, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. By 8 o'clock in the evening, snow began to fall outside the window. Large flakes swirled lazily in the air, covering the ground with a white carpet. Susan went to the window and smiled. She loved snowfalls, especially those that were so quiet, as if the whole world was frozen in anticipation of something magical. However, her smile faded when she noticed a strange movement at the edge of their yard. At first it seemed to her that it was just the shadow of a branch that was being shaken by the wind. But the shadow was too clear, as if someone was standing in the dark, watching the house. She grimaced, pushing away the stupid thoughts. Probably the neighbor's cat, she muttered to herself, closing the curtains. After a while, Susan went to the kitchen. She decided to bake more cookies to keep herself busy. Turning on the oven, she began to roll out the dough. The radio on the windowsill was quietly playing familiar Christmas tunes. But suddenly the music stopped. Instead, there was a faint hiss on the air, as if the radio had lost its signal. Susan frowned. She turned the radio off and on again, but the music didn't come back. Instead, the hissing grew louder, and then she heard a dull sound, as if someone had hit the glass. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned to look at the window, but saw nothing. Susan smiled nervously. The icicle must have fallen. She tried to focus on cooking, but the feeling of anxiety grew. It seemed to her that someone was looking at her. Half an hour later, when she had already put the finished cookies on a plate, Susan heard a floorboard creak on the upper floor. She froze, pressed against the countertop. The sound didn't repeat itself, but she was sure she hadn't imagined it. The house is old, she thought. It happens. Susan decided to go upstairs and check if everything was okay. Going up to the second floor, she walked along the corridor, looking into the rooms. Everything was in place. She was about to return downstairs when she noticed that the door to her room was slightly ajar. Susan remembered for sure that she had closed it when she left. She cautiously came closer and pushed the door open slightly. Nothing had changed inside, except for one detail. Her phone was lying on her bed. She was sure she had left it in the living room. Her breathing quickened. Someone was in the house. She quickly grabbed the phone and locked the door. After dialing 911, Susan was relieved to hear the operator's voice. She explained the situation, and the dispatcher assured her that the police would be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes seemed like an eternity to her. She sat on the bed, listening to every sound. A few minutes later, she heard someone coming up the stairs. The steps were slow and heavy. Susan gripped the phone tighter, not knowing what to do. The footsteps stopped in front of her door. Then she heard someone slowly turning the doorknob. "Who's here?" she shouted, trying to keep her voice from shaking. There was no response, but the pen kept moving. Susan stepped back, ready to throw whatever she could at the intruder. The sound of sirens outside made her cry out in relief. The pen froze, and then she heard footsteps receding. A minute later, there was a knock on the door. "The police! Open up!" Susan rushed to the door, unlocking the lock with trembling hands. 2 officers went inside, inspecting the house. "We found footprints in the snow around the house," one of them said. "Are you sure you didn't see anyone?" Susan shook her head, still in shock. "We will inspect the area, but you should call if anything else seems strange." The officers left, leaving Susan alone with her fear. She locked the doors and all the windows again. checking every corner of the house. The night seemed endless. She was sitting in the living room, hugging herself, listening for any sound. When it started to get light outside, Susan felt a little calmer. She was about to go to bed when something in the kitchen caught her attention. There was a note on the table. She definitely remembered that this had not happened before. Susan took it with trembling hands and unwrapped it. "You lock doors well, but it doesn't always help." Her heart skipped a beat. Susan rushed to the phone, but it wouldn't turn on. The battery was completely drained, although she is sure that she put it on charge. And then she heard a soft, barely audible sound of breathing behind her. Susan whirled around, but the room was empty. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, looking for anything that might betray the presence of another person. The curtains on the windows were drawn, the doors were locked, and there were no footprints on the floor. She was breathing heavily and unevenly, clutching the note in her hand. "Calm down. Just calm down. I've checked the whole house. It could have been in my head," Susan tried to convince herself. She walked slowly to the cupboard under the sink and took out a heavy frying pan. It was her only weapon in case someone did break into the house. Then she moved into the living room, making sure that no corner was left unattended. Every sound increased her fear. The creaking of the floorboards, the sound of the wind outside the window, even her own breathing sounded unusually loud. Susan decided not to go far from the front door. She stayed in the living room, sitting on the sofa in front of the window, through which the dawn was beginning to penetrate. She checked the lock on the door, then her gaze lingered on the next table, where her phone was still lying, silent and dead. The police promised to return in a few hours to check on her condition. But before they arrived, she needed to hold out alone. 8:30 a.m. Susan suddenly heard a noise from the backyard. The sound was short but clear, as if someone had dropped something metallic. Her breathing quickened again. She stood up slowly, the pan still clutched tightly in her hand. She went to the living room window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The snow-covered backyard looked calm. No movement, no footprints, except for those left by the police boots a few hours ago. She wanted to convince herself that it was an accidental noise. Maybe the lid of the trash can came off because of the wind. But something inside her said it wasn't that. 9:15 a.m. Susan finally decided to try charging her phone. She needed to call someone, at least her relatives. She went upstairs to her room, feeling a little more confident, because the morning light penetrated all the windows. Her charger was still on the bedside table. She plugged in her phone, but it wouldn't turn on. She checked the outlet and everything was in order. Susan couldn't figure out why the phone stopped working. She went back down to the kitchen to try another charger. At that moment, she noticed that the window above the sink was slightly ajar. "No, I was definitely closing it," she whispered. Susan rushed to the window and slammed it shut, feeling her hands tremble. Then she started checking all the windows in the house. Most of them were closed, but one in the basement was unlocked. She stood in front of the basement door, hesitating to open it. The basement always scared her with its darkness and dampness, but now this place has become the source of her greatest fear. Susan took a flashlight with her and went downstairs. The frying pan was still in her hand, and her eyes scanned every corner of the dark room. The basement seemed ordinary. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, a couple of cobwebby corners. But one thing caught her attention. A black glove was lying on the floor in the far corner. Susan knew it wasn't hers. She came closer to examine it, but froze when she heard the sound of footsteps from above. Someone was in the house. Her first thought was to hide in the basement, but the door to it remained open, and she knew that she would be easily found. So she carefully went back upstairs, trying not to make any noise. The footsteps were getting louder. They were in the living room. Susan was barely breathing, trying to assess the situation. She had one attempt to get to the front door, which was only a few meters away. She pressed herself against the wall, peering into the narrow hallway. A man in dark clothes stood with his back to her. He was obviously looking for something, moving things around on the table. Susan took a deep breath and rushed to the door. She turned the lock sharply and tried to open it, but did not immediately notice that the chain was still in place. This sound attracted the stranger's attention. He turned around and their eyes met. Susan didn't even try to see his face. She knew she had to run. The stranger rushed to her, but she managed to escape through the next door leading to the kitchen. She slammed it shut behind her and tried to get to the back door again. The man caught up with her, grabbing her hand. She screamed, hitting him with the frying pan with all her might. The man loosened his grip and she pulled away. At that moment, a siren sounded. Susan looked out the window and saw a police car pulling into the driveway. The man released her and rushed to the very window through which he had apparently entered the house. The officers ran out of the car, and Susan opened the door, screaming for help. She was saved. But it didn't end there. The police found out that this man was connected with several similar cases of penetration. He left creepy notes in each of them, but he never killed anyone. The question remained, why did he come? Why her? The only trace that could be found in her house was a fingerprint on her phone. It belonged to a man who had been dead for more than 15 years. Susan was sitting in the police station, hugging herself. The officer opposite, a man in his 40s with tired eyes, asked questions cautiously, but she barely listened to him. Her thoughts were out there somewhere, in her own home, which no longer seemed safe to her. "Are you sure you haven't seen this man before?" he asked. Susan shook her head. She had never met a stranger before, had not noticed suspicious people nearby, and, moreover, had not received threats. "He didn't say anything, did he? Not a word?" "No," she replied, her voice low. The policeman took a few notes and then changed the subject. "You mentioned that you found a black glove in the basement. Was it near a place he might have entered through?" Susan nodded. "But it's not my glove. And I haven't seen her there before," she added. The officer looked at her a little more closely before putting down his notebook. "We'll check it out. It's important that you're safe right now. If you want, we can assign you a temporary shelter while the investigation is underway." Susan thought about it. She knew that staying in her house would be risky, but the thought of leaving it was also unbearable. This was her home, her place, which she loved despite what had happened. "I don't want to leave," she finally said, "but I need protection." The policeman agreed. He promised that patrols would be on duty near her house, and a video surveillance system would be installed inside. When Susan returned home, the feeling of discomfort did not leave her. The lights were on brightly in every room, but the house still seemed empty and cold. She walked through the rooms, checking the cameras that the officers had installed. There was a space in each of them without a hint of movement, but that didn't calm her down. 22:15. Susan tried to sleep, but every rustle in the house made her alert. Clutching the phone tightly to her chest, she lay in bed listening to the sounds of her breathing. Then there was a soft vibration sound. Her phone turned on. The screen lit up, indicating that the battery has been restored. For a second, she was even pleased, but her joy quickly turned to concern when she noticed a strange notification on the screen. It looked like a standard system message, but the text was unusual. "Still at home? Great." Susan felt her blood freeze in her veins. She was trying to figure out what it could mean. The phone was in her hands. No one had touched it since it ran out of power. Susan knew she hadn't installed any new apps, and the message couldn't be a regular notification. She quickly called the police, but to her surprise, the line was busy. The only thing left was to review the footage from the cameras. She turned on the laptop connected to the system and began to study the footage. Nothing suspicious happened on the recording all evening. Cameras captured her walking from one room to another, or empty corridors while she was relaxing in the bedroom. But then, in the footage from the camera located in the living room, something changed. At about 2200 hours, a shadow flashed on the screen. At first glance, it might have been a movement of light, but Susan noticed that it was more than that. Too distinct, too sharp to be just a trick of the light. She rewound the recording, enlarging the image. There was indeed someone standing in the corner of the room, behind the chair. The figure was indistinct, but its silhouette stood out clearly against the background of the furniture. Susan felt a cold sweat covering her forehead. She stopped recording, turned off the computer and closed the laptop. She needed to do something, but panic paralyzed her. A knock on the window broke the silence. She screamed and turned to the window, expecting to see something terrible, but there was a police officer there. The man gestured to her that he was checking the house and asked her to open the door. Susan hurried to the door, removing the chain and turning the lock. "Is everything all right?" "What is it?" he asked, entering the house. "No. Someone was in the house. I saw it on camera," she said breathlessly. The officer quickly turned on the flashlight and began to inspect the house. "Where did you see the figure?" he asked. "In the living room, behind the armchair." "But I didn't hear anyone coming out," Susan said. The officer went to the indicated place. He scanned the corner of the room, then began checking the windows and doors. "Everything is closed. Maybe you saw a reflection or something like that," he said, trying to calm her down. But Susan knew it wasn't a reflection. "You have to check the recording yourself," she insisted. The officer sat down at her laptop and started playing the recording. When he got to the point with the figure, his face became serious. "Wait a minute. It couldn't be a reflection," he said. He rewound the recording again and zoomed in on the image. This time the figure seemed closer. She could be seen a little better. She was wearing a dark hood, and her face remained hidden. "We have to check the whole house," the officer said. They started going around the rooms, checking every corner, but everything was empty. However, when the officer looked into the closet on the second floor, he abruptly staggered back. "Damn it!" he swore. Inside the closet, on the back wall, someone left a fresh inscription. "I'll be back." Susan grabbed the door to steady herself, feeling her legs give way. "I can't stay here," she whispered, looking at the officer. "You're right. We'll get you out of here," he said firmly. But one question remained. Was someone still in the house, or was it the work of ghosts of the past who returned to remind themselves? Susan was already sitting in the police car outside the house, holding tightly to the steering wheel. The officer who was inspecting her house was standing in the doorway, talking to another patrolman. Their voices were restrained, but it was clear from the expressions on their faces that they were worried about the situation. "We'll take you to a safe place," the officer said, approaching the car. Susan nodded. She wanted to leave as soon as possible, forget this day and never return to the house that now terrified her. The police car pulled away, and Susan finally allowed herself to relax, feeling at least a little protected. "Do you know who it could be?" "What is it?" she asked, turning to the officer who was driving the car. "It's hard to say yet. We'll check the cameras again, try to figure out how he got into the house. He may have been following you in advance. But we will find him," the officer replied. Susan nodded, but she was uneasy. Something in his voice seemed strange to her. They had been driving for about 30 minutes when Susan noticed that the road had become less familiar. She tried to see where they were going, but the dark streets told her nothing. "Where are we? Is this the way to the police station?" "What is it?" she asked, alarm in her voice. The officer silently turned onto a narrow sidewalk and parked the car on the side of the road. "What are you doing?" Susan felt the panic begin to take hold of her again. The officer turned to her, his face serious and his gaze cold. "Susan," he began slowly, "do you understand what's going on?" She didn't know what to say. Her hands instinctively reached for the door handle, but the door wouldn't budge. All of this, he pointed at the car and their surroundings, this is not an accident. Susan felt her breathing become ragged. What do you mean? What is it? She asked, her voice trembling. Whoever was in your house left a trace. It was me. Those words hit her like lightning. What? What for? Her voice broke. You did something many years ago that you probably forgot a long time ago. But I haven't forgotten. You ruined my life, and I was waiting for the right moment to return the favor, he said. Susan was in shock. She couldn't remember anything that could lead to such hatred. I do not know what you are talking about, she shouted. Of course you don't know, because for you it was just a mistake, a trifle. But for me, it was the beginning of the end. His voice was getting louder. He opened his door and got out of the car. When he reached Susan's door, he leaned over and added softly, "You get out of this car, and we'll figure it out. But here, where no one will hear your screams." Susan tried to open the door from the other side, but nothing came out. She was screaming, banging on the windows, but there was no one around. "Help me!" She screamed in the hope that someone would hear her. The officer took a few steps back and pulled something shiny out of his pocket, a knife. But at that moment, the sounds of footsteps came from the forest. The officer turned abruptly, and two more policemen came out of the darkness with guns at the ready. "Get down on the ground," one of them shouted. It took Susan a moment to realize what was going on. The man in the uniform froze, then dropped the knife and raised his hands. One of the policemen came up to the car and opened the door. "Are you okay?" he asked Susan. She nodded, but still couldn't come to her senses. Later it was explained to her that this officer had been under suspicion for a long time, and he was being followed. His partners found out about his strange behavior and decided to follow the car. Susan returned home only a few days later, when new locks, cameras, and an alarm system were installed for her. Now she knew that threats could come not only from strangers, but also from those who, it would seem, were supposed to protect. Her life has never been the same. She no longer trusted people, even those who wore uniforms.